Everybody. I'm Kathy Gibbs. I'm the Director of Training for the New England ADA Center, and I'm delighted to be here to talk about the 30th anniversary of the ADA and some of the important issues, particularly how the ADA interacts with COVID-19. So just a little bit about what we're going to talk about. I'm going to tell you a little more about the ADA Center and also the ADA National Network. Just going to go over a few statistics. Then we're going to jump into COVID-19 and the ADA, and we'll talk about some resources. And then, of course, there will be time for your questions. When Congress passed the ADA, I think they realized it was sufficiently confusing that they needed to provide what they call technical assistance. And so Congress established what's called the ADA National Network, and the New England ADA Center, where I work, is a member of the network. We're a little up in the right corner, New England. We all have the same toll-free number, so the 1-800-949-4232. So if you're calling from a New England area code like 860, which is Connecticut, or 802, which is Vermont, you will get the New England ADA Center. If you are calling from a different area code in a different part of the country, you will get the ADA Center that's in that part of the country. Since people have been moving around and their cell phone numbers are now connected often with where they used to live, it gets a little bit confusing. Sometimes we get calls from people and they're actually living in California, and then we refer them to the Pacific ADA Center. And the reason we want people to be talking to their regional ADA Center is that many states have laws that are comparable to the ADA but different. And sometimes they provide more protection for people. So we want to make sure that you're talking to the ADA Center that's in your region. And then there's information about all of us on this website, www.adata.org. We are funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. Excuse me as my headphone falls out. And we are not enforcement agencies. We really exist to provide what's called technical assistance. We're trying to get voluntary compliance with the ADA, and we're trying to make sure that people with disabilities and advocates for people with disabilities understand what their rights are. So people call us, they email us, every call is confidential. We deal with employment, and sometimes we'll get a call from the employee, we'll get a call from their mother, we'll get a call from the employer, we may get a call from the union. So we might hear the story from different perspectives, but each one is confidential. So it's employment, it's education. We get a lot of calls from schools and also from students and parents. Facility access is a big issue. Transportation is a big issue. And then things like when are sign language interpreters required? So there's a whole part of the ADA that talks about effective communication. So we get lots and lots of calls about that, and really anything else. I mean, if it has to do with the ADA, we will provide information on it. And then the other thing that we do is training. We do workshops at conferences. We do presentations at events like this one. We do workshops for a school or a company or a municipality or a state agency, so they will contact us, and we are doing them all remotely now. And then we also organize workshops. So we're organizing one that's for healthcare professionals having to do with their obligations under the ADA, but we organize them on all different topics. And all of the ADA centers do that. So I know a lot of you are from New England, but some of you I think are with the Northeast ADA Center. You're in that region. And some of you might also be with the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center. We all do the same thing. The other thing that we have is we have web courses that are available 24/7. They're self-paced, they're free. We've got one which we call ADA Building Blocks, which is basically an overview of the ADA. There's one specifically on state and local government requirements. There's one on employment. There's one that's a disability rights overview. So it talks a little bit about special ed and Section 504 of the Rehab Act and the Fair Housing Amendments Act and other laws in addition to the ADA. There's one that's focused just on housing. And then there's one that's focused just on service animals and the ADA, because that's a hot issue. And then there's a really nice one that's on disability awareness and etiquette. We also do webinars, and these are on every aspect of the ADA. There are probably a few hundred by now. So we do them live, but then they're recorded. And so if you want to go back, these are just a few of the ones that have to do with employment. The interplay between the ADA and FMLA, which is a question, we get a lot of questions on this. Medical inquiries, hiring confidentiality, workplace accommodation for employees with psychiatric disabilities. So there's a lot on employment, but there's also a lot on every other aspect of the ADA. In fact, I attended one, participated in one on issues for post-secondary schools, which was very interesting, focusing on COVID-19. And then finally, we have an ADA coordinator training certification program. So providing a certification that somebody has basically completed training. There's a whole list of required courses, and that you have a depth of knowledge and you get a certification, and that's offered through the University of Missouri College of Human and Environmental Sciences and the Great Plains ADA Center. So we're pretty busy. Just a few statistics. 56.7 million people in the United States self-report a disability. And I know people often think of disability as somebody in a wheelchair or somebody who's blind or somebody who's deaf, but the most common reasons for functional limitations of adults in the US is arthritis, back problems, heart disease, respiratory disease, and psychiatric issues. And I think the reason for the first four is because of what an aging population we have. I mean, 50% of people over 65 report having a disability. So a lot of those things that I talked about, arthritis and heart disease and things like that really are something that is going to come with age, most likely. And then we did a lot of research on New England, because we're the New England ADA Center, and we have statistics for every state in our region and many of the municipalities. But I just wanted to show you sort of the overall percentage of adults 18 plus with disabilities in the New England region. 19% with a disability, 10.7% with a significant disability, upper body limitation, mental disability, 8.3%, use cane, crutches, and walker, hearing difficulties, vision difficulties. And as you can see, wheelchair use is very, very small. It was just 1%. So that was the statistics. Just to say a little bit about the ADA and sort of what's happened over the last 30 years. The ADA was signed, excuse me, in 1990, and that's first President Bush signing it. And then in 2008, we actually had Amendments Act, and that was signed by President Bush. I'm sorry, that was signed by President Obama. And this was really a major change. I mean, this is probably the largest change that's happened in the last 30 years. And the reason for the ADA Amendments Act was that there were a number of Supreme Court decisions that Congress really didn't like. It very narrowly defined who a person with a disability is. So the definition of disability in the ADA is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. So it has to affect a major life activity, it has to limit it, and it has to be a substantial limitation. And what was happening was people were filing complaints that they had been discriminated against, or they weren't getting reasonable accommodations. And the cases were being lost, not because the people weren't being discriminated against or weren't getting reasonable accommodations, but because the employer's attorney argued that the person didn't have an ADA disability. For example, there was a pharmacist who had diabetes, very severe type 1 diabetes, and his request to his employer was that he be able to eat lunch at the same time every day. And the employer said, no, we want people to be on various shifts. And so he sued. This went to court. And his employer, the employer's attorney, was able to argue that he didn't have an ADA disability, that he was actually functioning, he was taking medication, and therefore he didn't meet the definition of disability. So, and there were a number of Supreme Court cases like this, and I don't think Congress really intended that this was going to be so narrowly looked at. And so the ADA Amendments Act really emphasizes that the definition should be construed in favor of broad coverage and should not require extensive analysis, which made it easier for people seeking protection to establish that they have ADA disabilities. And Congress's message to employers was, we don't want you to spend a lot of time thinking about somebody meets this definition of disability. We really want you to focus on making sure people can get employed and can stay employed. And that's where your focus should be. So that was a big change, probably the biggest change. But the other big change in the last 30 years has been technology. And so that usually means technology is a reasonable accommodation. And you're probably mostly aware of these things. Screen reading software for people who are blind, text enlargement software for people with low vision, speech-to-text software for people with no or limited manual dexterity. So you speak, and then the text gets written onto the computer or your document. Assistive listening systems for people who are hard of hearing. Accessible software for people who are blind and others. This is very important, and it may not actually be a reasonable accommodation that somebody requests. I remember an employee who was blind who contacted us, and he was in the financial department, and he was going great guns, and his employer changed their software. And they changed their software to software that was not accessible for somebody who used screen reading technology. So you do have to be careful about what kind of software you're developing and what kind of software you're buying. And the same with websites. Accessible websites for people who are blind and people with other kind of disabilities. This is a particular barrier when we are all hiring people by having them apply on websites, having them apply online. So a lot of focus on making sure that websites are accessible. So that's what's changed, a little bit of an overview, some statistics. So now we'll talk about what are some of the issues with COVID-19 pandemic and the ADA. And it really has been a game changer. It's just turned a lot of things on its head. I mean, for all of us, that's true, but there are, some particular things having to do with the ADA. And we get a lot of calls about this. There's sort of a big issue about masks, whether or not stores and restaurants can require that patrons wear masks, but also for employers. An employer may require employees to wear protective gear, masks and gloves, and also to observe infection control practices like hand washing and social distancing protocols. But there's always a part of this is just part of Title I of the ADA, that an employer always has to consider reasonable accommodation for an employee who experiences difficulties wearing a mask or other protective gear due to a disability, for example, asthma or an anxiety disorder. And people talk about face shields, but face shields really are not comparable to masks. I mean, the Centers for Disease Control very clearly states that the face shields are really to protect your eyes. They're really not to protect because the air can get underneath them. So that's not going to be a substitute for wearing a mask. So I think employers really do have to consider whether or not there's a reasonable accommodation for somebody with a disability who's unable to wear a mask due to their disability, due to asthma or anxiety disorder or some other kind of situation. The other really big issue is that under the ADA, employers are only allowed to gather medical information in very limited circumstances. And that is after a conditional job offer. So the door is open. Before a job offer shut, after a conditional job offer is made open, employers can get medical information. When an employee requests a reasonable accommodation, If it's not obvious that the person has a disability or needs the accommodation, that's a time that the employer can request medical documentation or documentation about a disability. And then the other time is if there's evidence that the employee's ability to perform essential job functions will be impaired by a medical condition. So somebody, you might be noticing that somebody's having difficulty doing their job. We got a phone call from somebody who said, gee, I have an employee who's really hard of hearing and she is having a hard time at meetings and she's having a hard time on phone calls. And I need a little bit more information about what's going on. Is this an appropriate place for me to gather some medical information? And yes, because she was having difficulties doing her job. And then the other time is when an employer has reasonable belief based on objective evidence that an employee will pose a direct threat to the health and safety of others due to a medical condition. So this is called direct threat. And generally, or in the regulations require an individualized assessment of that employee's ability to safely perform the job, considering reasonable medical judgment, relying on the most current medical knowledge. So you're supposed to consider things like what's the duration of the risk, what would be the nature and severity of the potential harm, and the likelihood that the potential harm will occur. So, the regulations are very focused, and EEOC has always been very focused on this really needs to be an individualized assessment of a particular employee, and we shouldn't be using stereotypes or anything like that. It really needs to be based on very factual information. Oh, and the imminence that potential harm will occur. So COVID-19, the pandemic, is considered a direct threat. I mean, everybody is considered a potential direct threat, whether you have symptoms or not, because of course you can carry it without having symptoms. So this has really changed things completely in terms of what kind of questions employers may ask. And employers may ask employees if they have COVID-19, or if they've been tested for COVID-19, or if they have symptoms associated with COVID-19, such as a cough or a sore throat, fever, chills, shortness of breath. Employers can take employees' temperature. And the CDC really talks, and a lot of other medical places talk about 100.4 or greater is considered to be a fever. So that's sort of the point. Employers may also administer a COVID-19 test when evaluating an employee's initial or even continued presence in the workplace. Employers may exclude an employee who refuses to answer questions or have their temperature taken or be tested. Employers may also ask only one employee. So generally under the ADA, if you're going to do something very broadly, you want to do it with everybody. But in this situation, an employer could ask only one employee as opposed to asking all employees questions designed to determine if she has COVID-19. Again, if the employer has reasonable belief based on objective evidence that this person might have the disease. So you don't have to take everybody's temperature or require that everybody be tested. You could have it just for one employee, based on that information, reasonable belief. So confidentiality is always a big issue. The ADA is very clear about confidentiality. This is not news. This is in the regulations. It's been the case for 30 years that employers must keep medical information separate from personnel files. It needs to be in separate medical files and treated as a confidential medical record. In the early days of the ADA, the EEOC used to show filing cabinets and a key and stuff like that. Of course, all of our files, I think, are kept electronically now, but medical information does have to be separate and it needs to be treated as confidential medical record. So the question has come up, how are managers who are teleworking supposed to keep medical information confidential? while working remotely. And it may be that the employer has set something up, that there already is a system in place, an online system where everything has already been worked out to make sure that medical information is kept confidential. But the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and they're the federal agency, I think you probably all know this, that wrote the Title I employment regulations, provides technical assistance on them, and also enforces them. And so they are concerned, they want to make sure that notepads, laptops, or any other devices are not left where others can access the information, and that your documentation must not be stored electronically where others would have access. And then they had what I thought was a really good suggestion, which is that a manager could choose to use initials or another code to ensure confidentiality of the name of an employee. So we do have to keep confidentiality in mind. This question has come up a lot. If one employee tests positive for COVID-19, may an employer inform other employees? And the answer is that the employer may ask the employee for a list of people with whom the employee possibly had contact through the workplace. So the employer can notify those people, but the employer may not disclose the employee's name. And the other thing that the employer could do is the employer could say generally, that somebody has tested positive, one of our employees has tested positive for COVID-19, and therefore we are going to do X, Y, and Z, whatever steps they're planning to take as a result of that. But the person's name needs to be kept confidential. So this other question has come up. May an employee who knows that a coworker has symptoms associated with COVID-19 disclose the coworker's symptoms to a supervisor? Is there an ADA issue there? And no, there really isn't. It's not an ADA violation for the employee to inform his supervisor about a coworker's symptoms. They don't even necessarily have to know that they have COVID-19. The symptoms are of concern as well. And then hopefully every employer has some protocol that they've put in place when they find out that somebody has COVID-19 or symptoms connected with COVID-19, and then the supervisor should contact the appropriate officials and to discuss next steps. And hopefully all of our employers out there have already figured out next steps and aren't making it up as they go along. The other issue that comes up is that employers may not ask if family members have COVID-19 or symptoms. And that's not because of the ADA, it's because of GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which prohibits asking about family medical information. So a better question is really, you can ask the employee, has the employee had contact with anyone who has COVID-19 or symptoms associated with COVID-19? So it's not focused on the family, it's just a general inquiry, and it's fine. This comes up a lot also. We've had a lot of people contact us who have pre-existing mental illness or disorders that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. And so the question is, would such a person now be entitled to reasonable accommodation absent undue hardship? And undue hardship is always the balance to reasonable accommodation. And so I think that this is a tricky situation because so many of us are feeling stress due to the pandemic, and so many people want to work from home. This is sort of this issue comes up for us mostly with people who want to work from home as a reasonable accommodation. But the ADA does apply to people with disabilities. It doesn't just apply sort of to anybody. So if an employee has a pre-existing mental health condition, it could be anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. Such a person might have more difficulty handling the disruption of daily life, that has accompanied the pandemic. And so working from home is certainly a possible, teleworking is certainly a possible reasonable accommodation for a person in this kind of situation. So as with any accommodation request, employers may ask questions to determine whether the condition is a disability, request medical documentation if needed, if it's not obvious the person has a disability or it's not obvious that what they need is connected to the disability or what they've requested. They may discuss with the employee how the requested accommodation assists him and enables him to keep working, and then explore alternative accommodations that may effectively meet the person's needs. So here are some, reasonable accommodation possibilities. Designating one-way aisles. You've probably all seen this in supermarkets. I have to admit, I've gone down the wrong aisle and bumped into people. Part of the problem is it's on the floor, but you want to make sure you're using colorful, visible tape. And in the workplace, your employers are going to figure out which way the one-way aisles are. You may have to do a little training with your customers. Using plexiglass, I know we've all seen this. Tables. I was at my drugstore and they had put up some tables or other barriers to ensure minimum distances between customers and coworkers when feasible per Centers for Disease Control guidance. So we're really looking to the Centers for Disease Control, and as their guidance changes, ADA guidance will change as well. So they are bowing to the Centers for Disease Control, basically. So we do have to keep our eye on what the Centers for Disease Control are recommending. But, at this point, it is this 6 feet is what the CDC is talking about. Providing personal protective equipment for employees. And then another issue that's come up is for people who are deaf and hard of hearing, how difficult it is for them to hear, to understand people because of other people wearing masks. And people really rely on looking at somebody's face, their lip reading or their face reading. And so it could be that coworkers really need to use clear masks to communicate with an employee who is deaf or hard of hearing, or text more or email more. But really, this is a big issue. If you have an employee who's deaf or hard of hearing, the employer really needs to spend some time figuring out how this person is going to be able to communicate with customers and with coworkers. The biggest reasonable accommodation request is working at home, teleworking. Also, there could be temporary job restructuring of marginal job duties. And as I think you all are probably aware, the ADA makes a big distinction between essential job functions and marginal job functions. And essential job functions are the one that the person in this position has to do. They're their essential functions. And then there may be marginal job functions that you don't have to do. Maybe there are other people who could do them, or maybe they're temporarily marginal and not necessary. Temporary transfer to a different position. This is a little more tough. We don't tend to have positions open. But if there is, then a temporary transfer to a different position would be a possible reasonable accommodation. Keeping in mind, again, that the employee needs to perform essential job functions. And that's always the case. And a lot of job functions are in an office or in a school, and the functions need to perform there. If you're working at a store and you're selling things, you're going to need to be there. You're going to need to be behind the cash register or helping people bring the shoes out for people to try on. And the same with things in a school. Often people have to be there. And this has come up so much this fall, where teachers really feeling uncomfortable and wanting to teach remotely. And this may or may not be feasible. First of all, the person may or may not have a disability as it's defined under the ADA, and therefore they may or may not have rights under the ADA to even have a reasonable accommodation. But then what are the particulars of the situation? Is this a special ed class? Is this a kindergarten? Somebody needs to be interacting with the children. Is this something you can really be doing remotely? What are the implications? Who's going to be in the classroom? There needs to be an adult there, generally at least for many classes for K through 12, probably you're going to need to have somebody there. So there's a lot of issues that's come up with the teaching remotely. Now, the other thing that's come up a lot is timeframes during the pandemic. So everything is taking more time. More employees are requesting accommodations. An employer has a right to medical documentation, as I said, but receiving medical documentation and making those accommodations decisions has really gotten backed up. We've had phone calls from people who are, almost in tears because they made their request for a modification accommodation to work at home. They made it a week ago. They haven't heard anything. Maybe they provided medical documentation. They still haven't heard anything. And meanwhile, they've been on unpaid leave. They've been home. So things are really getting backed up. And EEOC suggests that employers may opt to provide a requested accommodation on an interim or trial basis with an end date while awaiting receipt of medical documentation. Well, notice they don't say employers have to, they say employers may. So this is a recommendation that they've made to employers is, think about providing the reasonable accommodation, even if you haven't actually gotten the documentation and maybe you haven't gone through the whole process, but no requirement that you do so. Now, undue hardship, as I said, is always the balance to reasonable accommodation. So yes, somebody might need something because of their disability, but if it's an undue hardship, the employer is not required to provide it. Whether that be $100,000, software or some kind of equipment or whatever. So, the question becomes, are the circumstances of the pandemic relevant to whether a requested accommodation can be denied because it poses an undue hardship? And so an employer, basically undue hardship means significant difficulty or expense. So it's not necessarily that something is very expensive. It could be that it's very difficult or it's going to have a large impact on the workforce. But what we've discovered is that an accommodation that may not have been an undue hardship prior to the pandemic may now pose one. At this point, everything has changed. People's employers' incomes have changed. So the workforce has changed. More people need to work at home. So it may be significantly more difficult, first of all, to conduct a needs assessment, to acquire certain items, to provide employees with temporary assignments, to remove marginal functions, and to hire temporary workers. That thing with the school where so many people want to stay home, well, who are you going to hire to be in the classroom? Not necessarily available. Now, as with any accommodation discussion, if a particular accommodation poses an undue hardship, then the employer and the employee are supposed to work together to determine if there may be an alternative that could be provided that does not pose such problems. And then there are considerations really having to do with expense. So, some things have to do with significant difficulty and some things have very specifically to do with expense. And there definitely are implications from the pandemic concerning expense. And that is for many employers, their loss of income. And that is going to have an effect often on what kind of an accommodation they can consider. What's the discretionary funds available? You have to consider all of your other expenses. Is there an expected date that the current restrictions on the operations will be lifted, or there may be new restrictions that will be added or will be substituted? So, everything has really changed in terms of the undue hardship analysis. What might not have been an undue hardship a year ago might be an undue hardship now for an employer. About the informal interactive process, and this is not new. This is in the Title I regulations. It's been there, from the very beginning. And I think a lot of employers often overlook this, and it's very important And EEOC considers it to be very important, and there have been a number of lawsuits and settlement agreements because the employer has dropped the ball on the informal interactive process. Sometimes the employee drops the ball, but more often it seems the employer drops the ball. And so the issue is if an employer is going to say no, you can say yes, then you don't have to have an informal interactive process. Or if you're going to say no, or if you feel like something is going to be an undue hardship, the employer and the employee is supposed to work together to determine if there's an alternative that does not pose such problems. And as I said, the regulations require this informal interactive process when deciding on accommodations. It could be an email exchange. It could be a Zoom meeting. In the old days, we used to say sit down together. The employer knows the essential job functions. The employee knows their medical conditions and knows their limitations and hopefully knows the essential job functions. And the idea is let's try to figure out a way this is going to work for both of us so that the employee is doing the essential job functions to the performance standard that the employer sets. The employer never has to lessen the performance standards. But for the employee with the medical problems or the disability related problems, are there accommodations that are going to allow them to meet the employer's performance standards for their essential job functions? And that is the informal interactive process. Hiring. Maine employers screen applicants for symptoms of COVID-19. Yes, an employer may screen job applicants for symptoms of COVID-19 after making a conditional job offer, as long as it does so for all entering employees in the same type of job. And the same thing for temperature taking. Yes, medical exams are permitted after making a conditional offer of employment. You know, I think that we are all aware that some people with COVID-19 do not have a fever. But yes, and this is really not news. I mean, an employer has always been able under the ADA to ask medical information, do a medical exam after a conditional job offer. So, you know, before the job offer, during the application process, no discussion about medical information, but after that conditional job offer, that's the time when the door is open. Maine employer withdraw job offer when it needs the applicant to start immediately, but the individual has COVID-19 or symptoms of it. And so generally, yes, the Centers for Disease Control, again, are very clear that a person in that situation should not be safely entering the workplace, and therefore the employer may withdraw the job, keeping in mind that when you make a conditional job offer and you get medical information that indicates there's a direct threat or that somebody might be having difficulty doing their job, an employer always has to consider reasonable accommodation. So if this is a job that could be done teleworking, then the employer would need to consider that as a reasonable accommodation. So that's the ADA at 30 and COVID-19. I'm going to go over some resources. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has been extremely helpful. They came out with information right off the bat in March, and they've kept it updated, which is really nice. What you should know about COVID-19 and the ADA, the Rehabilitation Act, and other EEO laws, and that's on their website. You just have to go to eeoc.gov, and they've got like, bam, you can go to right to coronavirus. They also came out with pandemic preparedness in the workplace and the Americans with Disabilities Act. And then another really good resource, which hopefully all of you know about anyway, is the Job Accommodation Network, which is www.askjan.org. And they've got really great, they have a whole series on accommodation and compliance, on everything. So every kind of disease or medical condition or disability from A to Z, from Alzheimer's to, I don't know what a Z disease would be, but They've got terrific resources on accommodation ideas. And the other thing is that you can contact them, you can ask them questions, you can set up a phone meeting. If you have a particular employee or job applicant, you know, with a particular medical situation and a particular job, and you really want to do some thinking before you discuss it with the employer, you know, what are some accommodations for this particular employee? But there's stuff on coronavirus I think is very particularly helpful. General resources, so New England ADA Center, that's us, but I think we talked about, you know, this phone number will get you to your regional ADA center. Our online employment course, of course, we think is terrific. EEOC is great, and then the Job Accommodation Network. So thank you, and now it's time for your questions.